Welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am Brian Berletic. Joining me as always is Angelo Giuliano. We took a bit of a break. We're going to try to get back to once a week or every other week, something like that. And today we've got a lot to talk about because the United States, they are creating problems everywhere. They are ratcheting up tensions in Eastern Europe. Centered on Ukraine, and they have been continuously causing problems here in Asia vis-a-vis China. And the Olympics were something the U.S. Invested huge amounts of time and energy into trying to ruin, and they have just made such a mess out of it. We're going to talk about the human cost this is already having. There has not been a war yet, but there are already people being abused, being victimized as part of this process, as part of what the U.S. has been doing. So the first thing, let's start at Ukraine. And I just want to show people this video. I'm going to put it up on the screen here, and it's in the video description below. This is Angelo. Angelo, you interviewed Patrick Lancaster. He is in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and he has been there for years, and he is covering it, and he is covering things that nobody else is talking about, not in the Western media. Can you please tell us a little bit about this interview, Angelo?
So Patrick Lancaster, he's been in a Donbass region. So Donbass region is the eastern side of Ukraine, speaking where you have the majority of ethnic Russians. And there's been a war there, a civil war between the forces from Kiev, bombing civilians. There's been 14,000 people that died, and it's basically Ukrainian army fighting the pro-independence, because what they're looking for actually, they want not only independence but even join the Russian Federation. So Patrick Lancaster has been there since 2014, since the Maidan Revolution, the US-backed Maidan Revolution, up to now, and he's on the ground. So he's telling everything about what is happening. And you know what? The shelling hasn't stopped since 2014. So still now, there were like the Minsk agreement in 2015, and they've kept on shelling civilian population. So and this is not reporting in the Western media. So Patrick Lancaster has been actually in the trenches. During the bombing, he was in the trenches, and he's a great witness, and he's very brave. What he's doing there, he's putting his life in danger. And if there was to be an invasion of Donbass, he would be in great danger.
And I watched the whole interview. It was very excellent, and he's saying things that if you've been researching this, you already know these things already, but it's just when you hear someone talking about it, someone that's there and someone who's documenting it. This is his channel where he puts all of his videos, all of the coverage from the Donbass region. When you see that, and then you see these reports coming out of the West, I mean, it's just surreal, the level of disinformation that people are exposed to. And when you look at honest to God people on Twitter who buy into this, how brainwashed they are, how divorced from reality they are because of this propaganda. It's mind-boggling. I don't even know what to say about it. But this is a great interview. The link is in the video description below. Please check out Angelo's interview with Patrick Lancaster. It really is worth a listen, especially if you're wondering what's going on in Ukraine, what started this. There's a lot of talk in the interview about the background and what the new government in Ukraine, the government in Kiev that the U.S. installed into power after overthrowing the elected government, what they have been doing and how, in actuality, they're doing things that constitute genocide, an attempt to eradicate ethnic Russians from Ukraine, things that they are accusing China of doing without any evidence at all, things that the government in Kiev with U.S. backing is openly doing. And let's talk a little bit more about what's going on in Ukraine. Now, Angela, you suggested that we include this tweet from Melinda Herring. And first of all, who is Melinda Herring? She is from the Atlantic Council, but if you look at her background, you can see that she was also over at Freedom House and the National Democratic Institute. These are subsidiaries of the National Endowment for Democracy. She's basically a U.S. government-funded meddler. That's what she does. She meddles all around the world. She takes U.S. government money and she funds opposition groups that will serve U.S. interests in these targeted countries. And a lot of it are countries along Russia's border and Russia itself. And so there's this huge conflict of interest. And what did she say? She said, this is so funny.
Can you go to the original? This is actually, she retweeted, but if you go, you can go, well, yes, this original
this
tweet.
One.
Putin has a big weekend plans in Ukraine. I mean, she's telling us, I mean, everything that he's going to do. I mean, this is madness. I mean, you know, remember Putin has been saying like hundreds of times, he doesn't want to invade Ukraine. I mean, why would you invade Ukraine? You know, Russia is the largest country in the world, you know, in terms of, like land side, you know, it's massive. I mean, why would you invade Ukraine? He's been like very clear all along. He just wants to protect Russian minorities in Ukraine, you know, in the Donbass, because there's an ethnic genocide happening right now in Ukraine. Nobody knows it, but that is what is happening right now in Ukraine. And he doesn't want NATO expansions, that's it. And he's saying, I'm not interested in invading Ukraine. Now you have Melinda Herring, she's saying, well, Russia is going to cut power and heat, knock out Ukrainian Navy and Air Force, kill general staff and hit them with cyber attack, then install pro-Russian president, and 3, resort to full-scale military invasion if Ukraine doesn't give in. I mean, she says this is for the weekend, right? And then you have a few days later, because it didn't happen, she say, oh, I was too emotional. I mean, you, Melinda, and I'm going to send this video to Melinda later. You are working for a think tank that is a NATO think tank, and this is what you are doing. You are actually you're wishing for war, you're pushing for war, and you see this is like it's a combined effort between Western media and think tanks and politicians, we saw the. I mean, what was the most hilarious is that you had the Kiev, the Ukrainian president Zelensky. He needs to go to the media and saying, "Well, stop. There's no risk of invasion. This is my country, and I know what is happening in my country." You even have the president of Ukraine saying, "Wait, I don't want war, because the directions we're going is to have a war, and I'm on the ground. I know better than Americans what is happening." So you see, I think Zelensky is being hostage, and he doesn't want to go to war. I mean, why would you go to war? And there's no risk. I mean, this whole narrative about Russians being ready to get into Ukraine. I mean, imagine what Russia has to lose, in doing that. They're just doing exercises. And remember, Russian troops are in Russia. They're not in Donbass. Since 2014, actually, they've been Ukrainian media have been saying lots of lies about this. And Patrick Lancaster says this clearly. What you have in Donbass is not Russian troops, is ethnic Russians that are fighting for their home, and they don't want to follow the illegal government in Kiev. Because it was a coup in 2014 backed by neo-Nazi. Why would you want a president that you didn't elect, and that is actually neo-Nazi, and they want to eradicate your own culture?
Yeah, so there's a lot of what's going on in Ukraine is you have ethnic Russians, and they have their own way of doing things, and there was this kind of uneasy balance before the U.S. overthrew the elected government. The elected government of Ukraine before the coup in 2014 represented kind of a compromise between all of these different groups in the country. It also represented a compromise between East and West, where Ukraine was able to do business with Russia and also with Europe. They did not want to commit to the EU or to NATO. And last episode of Inflection, you and I talked about how NATO, the Atlantic Council, the NED, they have all openly talked about how they're going to absorb all of Europe and eventually Russia. This is the goal, and Russia is not blind to this. They see what the West is doing, what the U.S. is doing, and that NATO is expanding up to their border and eventually wants to absorb Russia itself. It's plain as day. You had people like John McCain, a U.S. senator, talking about the Arab Spring and how it was eventually going to lead to Moscow and Beijing. And we could see that happening right now today. What is the U.S. Teeing up for war with Russia and with China? It's so obvious. And someone like Melinda, I mean, I'm just like this. These are very specific. This is a very specific list. Who fed this to her? I just want to know where she got this. And how ridiculous. Russia already knocked out the Navy, the Air Force, all the generals are dead. And then they're going to also do a cyber attack on top of that. Like they're going to make sure you can't watch your Netflix either. I mean, how does she hear herself? And again, she is someone who is at the Atlantic Council, this think tank that sells talking points to the media, the Western media. All these people buying it, it's coming from people like her. And she had been involved in building up these opposition groups that we always hear are being oppressed in Belarus, in Russia, in all of these countries the U.S. is targeting. And they're doing the exact same thing here in Asia to encircle, contain, and eventually, in their dreams, absorb China. I want to show this. This also popped out. And Angelo, I think you made a comment you could add on. This is Anthony Albanese from the Australian Parliament. I think I got the video here.
He's the leader of the opposition, the Labour Party, by the way. So, and actually, if there was Labour Party is actually leading in the polls. So, if there was to be elections now in Australia, Labour Party would win. But I doubt that the policy, when it comes to geopolitics, it wouldn't change much. But
let's just see if I can play. Let's hear if we can.
Last Friday, I met with the chairman of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations, Stefan Romaniu, and other Ukrainian community leaders in Melbourne. And I indicated to them Labor's clear position of solidarity with the people of the Ukraine and our absolute rejection of any Russian military action that violates Ukraine's sovereignty and its independence. Yeah. Labor stands with the people of Ukraine and all Ukrainian Australians at this difficult time. If Russia continues down the path of aggression, it will be attacking one of the core principles of the post-World War II order, which is that all UN members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
So I got to stop him right there, because what has Australia been doing since the turn of the century, all throughout the 21st century? Australia has been connected at the hip with the United States invading Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. They've been everywhere, murdering people, carrying out war crimes, doing exactly what he's claiming in fiction he thinks Russia is going to be doing. Australia is guilty of the serial instances of exactly what he's accusing Russia of. In absolute fiction. Let's let him finish.
This is a simple, clear principle. Mr. Putin must understand that it is not in the long-term interests of the Russian people to continue down this path. The era of spheres of influence and other such pseudo-imperial constructs has been consigned to the dustbin of history. Australia should unite with our allies and friends in sending the strongest of messages that Russia needs to back off, and it needs to back off right now.
So this is, I want you to tell us a little more about his backstory. But first, this is, hold on, let's see, we got to add this. This is Australia, and this is Ukraine. And he's talking about spheres of influence. And this is the same Australia that signed on to Aukus. And what is Aukus? Because while we got the map out, Aukus is the United Kingdom all the way over here. The United States, which I have to move the map to see, it's all the way over here. And Australia all the way in the southern hemisphere. They are creating Aukus to exert a sphere of influence over the Indo-Pacific region, where none of these countries are even located. So what nonsense. And Angelo, can you tell us a little more background about this guy? What else is this Ukrainian organization that he was hanging out with? This Stefan Romeu.
Yeah, Romeo. I have a hard time just pronouncing his name, but he's the chairman of the Australian Federation of Ukrainians. So that's a very old organization. It has probably 60, 70 years, you know. But this person is actually, he represents a party of what we call the Banderites. Banderites, it derives from Stepan Bandera. He's a Nazi collaborators in the World War II. So he collaborated with the Hitler, and they did like massacres in the whole region. This movement is behind the Maidan coup. So during the Maidan coup, you had those neo-Nazi factions. You had the right sector. You had the Azov battalion, and very often they have this flag that you see very often in protest in Ukraine. Those flags like black and red, and so you have this Australian politician is meeting with the neo-Nazi. And I just wonder, I mean, if he only knew that he's a neo-Nazi, but this has become normal. Remember, there was a vote at the UN against the glorification of fascism and Nazis, and there were 2 countries that actually voted against this law that would penalize countries, glorifying a Nazi, and the 2 countries were Ukraine and the US. And it's unbelievable that this is what is happening right now in Ukraine. So, no wonder that you have people in the Donbass that say that we don't want to be part of that. This is not the president we elected. And keep in mind that since 2014, what they did, even though Zelensky was elected democratically, but what happened is that they changed the rules. They changed the rules of the game. They expelled the opposition. You know, there's many politicians from the oppositions that are in jail right now. They shut down Russian media. So now, what is that a democracy? That's not a democracy. They changed the rule of the game, and now you have a minority, an oppressed minority. 30% of Ukrainian population is Russian, and they don't have the same rights as the Ukrainian speaking. You know, so why would you support this government? I mean, of course, you want to be independent. You don't want to be part of that, and this is the root of the problem in Donbass. And now you have Russian don't want Donbass to turn into what happened in Yugoslavia. Remember the ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia, the Serbians that were actually attacked, you know, in Kosovo, everywhere, because, well, that's the risk. So they don't want ethnic cleansing. That's the main reason Putin does wants to help the Donbass, because well, keep in mind also, since the USSR, you know, you had all those countries that are very young. They don't have the concept of nation, and you had all those mixes where you have, you know, lots of minorities. You can find Russians everywhere, in Kazakhstan, in Moldavia. I mean, in Georgia. Why do you think that there were problems in Georgia? It was very similar, you know, and Putin had to protect Russian minorities. That's the reason, you know, but we never talk about this. And they're pointing a finger at China. Well, I mean, while China, you know, there was no refugees. You know, in China, they say there's a genocide happening in China. How many refugees you have? Uyghurs that went outside of China? Not many. And the few that went out from China, they're working for the National Endowment for Democracy, and the actors being paid to tell lies. You know how many refugees since 2014 in Ukraine? Over 2 million. And those are facts. You know, you cannot have a genocide and not have refugees. You have refugees in Ukraine. You have since 2005, the first color revolution was orange color revolution. Up to now, 10 million people left Ukraine.
Yes.
What is the good that those revolutions did to Ukraine? 10 million people left Ukraine. The GDP of Ukraine is half what it was in the since independence in 1990. I mean, what good did it do? And you know, the people that left Ukraine is all the young people, you know, the graduated, and they're being used right now in Europe as cheap labor. What good did it do to have those revolution in Ukraine? It was just a destruction. And Ukraine now is a failed state. Now Ukraine is just living on loans that the EU and the US is giving to Ukraine. And it's going to actually lose one of the main resources, which is the gas transit. This is why they're opposing Nord Stream 2. Because once they will implement Nord Stream 2, then they will shut down all the gas that is going through Ukraine. You know, I think there's Russia and Ukraine, they have a contract up to 2024. And after 2024, you know, Ukraine will lose $2 to $3 billion of transit fee.
And it's pretty clear that if you look at even the government in Ukraine right now, I think they can kind of tell that they're getting ready to get left thrown under the bus basically by the West. I think they can see all the signs are there, and they don't necessarily want to be friendly toward Russia, but they also don't want to keep going in this direction where they're going to pay the cost for this entire project. Which you look in Ukraine, you look at Georgia, you look at the Baltic, you look at all of these regions. There's all these little local stories, but the overall picture is NATO expansion, US hegemony over Europe, and then extending it over Russia eventually. And they're doing the exact same thing in Asia, where they're trying to overthrow all of these governments surrounding China, and then eventually encircle and contain China itself. And you were talking about these are neo-Nazis. This isn't hyperbole where they're right wing, so we're going to call them Nazis to put them down. They're actual Nazis. They're into Nazism. And there is Bandera, the World War II Nazi collaborator. And these were all the flags. If you look here, these were all the flags you saw during the Maidan protests. And there's Svoboda, which is a political party with the three-finger salute. They're neo-Nazis, and you see the red and black. That was the flag of the Nazi collaborators during World War II. And they're still out there openly, and they have been given a prominent place politically and militarily in Ukrainian society since the 2014 coup. So this is what's going on. This is what ethnic Russians in Ukraine face. This is why Crimea rejoined Russia. This is what Russia has brewing on its border. And just like everything else the US does, it is lighting a fire to divide and destroy the country, and also to create a problem right on Russia's border. They have no interest in building Ukraine up. Just like you said, Angelo, with the gas transit, this was an important part of their economy. The 2014 coup disrupted a lot of Ukraine's industries. They had a tank deal with Thailand that they weren't able to fulfill, and Thailand went and bought tanks from China instead. This is costing Ukraine. Well, I was talking about Aukus. This will be in the video description below. You could read this. This is Australia as part of a pact to exert influence in a sphere of influence, and they're saying Russia has no right to have a sphere of influence right on its border, but Australia has the right to go into another hemisphere and exert influence with the UK and the US from opposite sides of the ocean. And then there was this is actually Human Rights Watch. This is what Human Rights Watch does all the time. They will touch on a topic and then bury it. And then when you say, well, didn't you say something about that? And they're like, oh yeah, it's right here. We made this article about it. We never campaigned or brought any attention to it, but we talked about it. New language requirement raises concerns in Ukraine. And of course, everything in this article is understated. But this is the Ukrainian government passing laws to subordinate the Russian language and essentially push it out of public use. So this would be like China, not in fiction like the Western media claims, but in reality, if they were to attack the Uyghur language, start taking it off of signs, start shutting down Uyghur language media, and just basically eradicating the language entirely. This is what they're doing in Ukraine openly. And you even have Human Rights Watch and the Atlantic Council writing about it and talking about it, but they're trying to downplay, spin, and defend it rather than bring the attention to it that it needs. And not like what they're doing to China, where they're just making up stories about what's going on. And again, like, so that was Human Rights Watch. This is the diplomat. China's effort to silence the sound of Uyghur. Like, you could go to Xinjiang and you could see Uyghur language on official signs. It's everywhere. They're not shutting anything down. And so this is what I'm talking about. The Western media lying about it happening in China. And when it's actually happening in Ukraine, they're covering it up, spinning it, downplaying it. So this is something that the West does everywhere across the board. And when it suits their interests, all of these principles go out the window, and they push things that are obviously wrong. And then when it suits their interests to pretend, even just pretend it's happening somewhere else, that's what they'll do. So you can compare and contrast Ukraine and Xinjiang. You could see how the West is actually really playing this game. Angelo, is there anything else you want to say about?
Yeah, well, I'd like to add something. I mean, I've been in China for over 25 years, and when it comes to minorities, minorities for China is the pride of the Chinese nation. China, you have to look at China as a civilization state. It's not even a country. It's a continent. It's so big. You have 55 nationalities, and the large majority is the Han Chinese, and then you have the minorities. For a long time, there was a one-child policy, and the one-child policy was never applied to minorities. So the minorities could have 2-3 children, no problem. So you had this positive discrimination. In reality, they were like protecting, and it was the pride of those minorities. They wanted to promote the language, promote the culture, and what they say is exactly the opposite. So you see, they talk about the genocide. The population of the Uyghur in Xinjiang increased much more than the Han Chinese. And, how can you talk about a genocide? Even like getting to universities, actually, they had positive discrimination. So if you were from a minority, it was a good thing because you could get in the best universities. If you're a minority. So it's just exactly the opposite. And if you are talking about genocide, this is what is happening in Russia. At the moment, the society is very polarized between Ukrainians and Russians within Ukraine. It's getting dangerous to speak Russian in Ukraine right now. You have shops that are targeted. Oh, Brian, the sound you cut the sound. I can see the microphone is shut down. Can you?
Sorry.
Yes,
I was gonna say, this is just like in Hong Kong when people were walking on eggshells. They didn't want to speak Mandarin in case U.S. backed mobs heard them and would go after them just for speaking Mandarin.
Yeah, actually, remember in Hong Kong what they did? They actually started to polarize the society with the language. So I was with my partner. We would go into the street, and actually we wouldn't speak Mandarin just because of fear of being targeted. So what they did in Hong Kong was they called the blue economy and yellow economy. So you had the yellow economy, which was anti-Chinese, and basically they said, well, if you are anti-Chinese, anti-mainland China, you should shop only into yellow shops. And if you were blue shops, you were targeted. And the irony here is that they even targeted Starbucks. You know why? Because the chain, the franchising of Starbucks belonged to mainland Chinese. How ridiculous. You are backed by the US, and then you are actually burning shops, Starbucks. We were talking about hundreds of shops targeted Starbucks. And it was a very random. I mean, every day you would see like those shops like being targeted. So you see, it's the same thing that is happening. It's the divide and control. This is how you do. You divide society. You demonize the police. In 2014, what they did in Maidan, they did the same in Hong Kong. You demonize the police. You start like creating fake news. Oh, police is raping protesters. They're beating up students and so on. And you just focus on the reaction of the police, the reactions of the violence of the protesters. When the cameras are only on the police, you don't see what the violence of the police is only a reaction of the original violence that comes from the protesters.
And Angelo, we were talking about this kind of behind the scenes. I showed you this NPR article. I don't remember. I'd have to go digging for it, but they were in a region that had been very pro-Russian in Ukraine, and then NPR and the rest of the Western media is going to ignore all of this intimidation, these laws that are being passed to crush ethnic Russian, the language, the traditions, and people just speaking out. So, like you said, people in Hong Kong were afraid to even speak Mandarin. So NPR goes to this city in Ukraine, and they're like, it used to be very pro-Russian, but now it's not. And they're bragging and talking like this is, people have changed their minds. No, they haven't. They have been put in fear. They are being intimidated. They are being terrorized. They will not speak up, and NPR is not going to speak up about this and expose this abuse. This is a human rights abuse when people are living in fear to speak their own language or to carry out their own traditions. That is a human rights abuse. And notice how all of these fake human rights groups, I call them fake human rights groups because this is what they do. It's very cynical, and they act as if, the people there, they just realized how much sense it makes to be on the side with this neo-Nazi government in Kiev, backed by the U.S., gutting their own economy and throwing themselves on their own sword to spite Russia. Basically, they just came to this logical conclusion that that's the way to go, and they're going to pretend that it has nothing to do with terrorism and intimidation. Go ahead, Angelo. Yes.
I'd like to add something which is really important. People, they see those coups, those revolutions. In Maidan in 2014, we are talking about 2,000-3,000 radicals. When in a country of 45 million people, so 2,000 to 3,000 people, actually, they can take over government. This is what happened. Those revolutions are extremely a small minority of extremists that took over the power. Why is it so? Because the majority of people, 95% of people are not politicized. 95% of people, they go along. They're in a survival mode. And remember, in Maidan, people were actually paid to protest. Many people were paid. You had even mercenaries coming from Georgia. Snipers coming from Georgia. So you see, this was not a revolution by the people. It's 3,000 people that are hijacking a whole country. That is what happened. It was not a liberation movement. No, it was backed. They said Victoria Nuland. Actually, she said in a presentation, she said that the U.S. has put $5 billion to create a revolution in Ukraine. So it was not an initiative of Ukrainians. The same as the independentist movement in Taiwan. Do you think that Taiwanese, they came up with the idea, we are going to be independent? No. It's millions of dollars that are poured into Taiwan media to change Taiwan thinking. They want, and slowly people start thinking, you know what? Maybe the EU is and NATO is the good thing for us. And and you look at geography, you look at trade. Ukraine in Russian history. Kiev used to be the capital of Russia, long time ago. It's part of Russia. I'm not saying that Russia is not interested in integrating Ukraine. Why? Absolutely not. But then you cannot undo history. So now you have Ukraine actually that is rewriting its history to World War II and linking its history to Stepan Bandera. The same is happening in Taiwan. They're rewriting history and saying, well, you know what? It's not, Sun Yat-sen, back in 1910, the creation of China. It's when we flew from the mainland to Taiwan. They're rewriting history. And it is only one generation for people, to brainwash kids. Now you have those brainless kids in Ukraine saying, we are, we descend from Stepan Bandera. And you have those brainless kids in Taiwan saying, it's just, we're not Chinese, we're Taiwanese. Well, look at yourself in the mirror. You're not Taiwanese, you are Chinese. You're Chinese. Learn history. History, we're talking about 4,000 or 5,000 years of history, not 70 years.
And notice how they're going after kids, because kids, you like you said, in just one generation, if they can get into the schools, and this is what the NED and Open Society, this is what they do. This is all they do, is they infiltrate the media, they infiltrate the education system, they get to these professors, and they start putting these ideas into the kids' heads. They're doing it here in Thailand. They have completely done it in Myanmar. They were trying in Cambodia. Taiwan is a perfect example. Hong Kong was, you were talking about what was it, the textbooks in Hong Kong about how it was like glorifying the British Empire. You basically these white people that came across the ocean to subjugate you in your own land and to hate the mainland. This is what they were doing, and they're doing it for sure in Ukraine. You have a lot of old timers who are like bitter about World War II and the Cold War. You have a lot of them, and now you've got this young generation that are going to fall into it. I had this picture up here. I just wanted to make the point where Ukraine is actually passing laws to eradicate the Russian language, and you have to have Human Rights Watch and Atlantic Council downplay it. And if you just look at the money in China, it has Uyghur language on it. It has the language on it. They're not trying to eradicate something that is on their money. You know what I mean? Like when they take it off their money and it's disappearing everywhere and they're passing laws to get rid of it, then you might be able to say it's almost as bad as what's going on in Ukraine. And then you have to ask yourself why they're not talking about that, why they're making up stories about something in China and ignoring something that's actually happening in Ukraine. So this is extremely dangerous, this whole process. What's going on in Ukraine now? Where are we right now with Ukraine and also Taiwan? We wanted to talk about China today also, and how the U.S. is creating this a global crisis through these two pressure points and everything in the middle. Those two republics in eastern Ukraine, what I could see happening is Russia maybe in the future supporting them or backing them to a certain degree, and that because what Russia wants is not to take over Ukraine. They don't want that. They want a buffer between them and NATO. This is what they have always said since the Cold War all the way up until now. That's what they want. And if the U.S. gave Russia that, and the West had promised not to continue expanding NATO, and they lied and they went back on their word, just like they're going back on the one China policy with China. If they were to just do that, this crisis would not exist. And even with all of their efforts trying to make this crisis explode, they are having a hard time doing it. Before we start focusing a little more on China, Angelo, is there anything else you want to add in about Ukraine?
Well, just the latest news about Ukraine. There's actually a vote that is going to be passed in the Duma in Russia. It's about recognizing the independence of the Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk. And this has to be approved ultimately by Putin. So this would change. Actually, and this would go against the Minsk agreement. But as we know, Ukraine doesn't want to recognize the Minsk agreement. Minsk agreement came because Ukraine lost against Donbass. I mean, it was a war fought by civilians, and they beat up like really badly Ukrainian army. So when you lose, you're disadvantaged. So Ukraine doesn't want to follow the Minsk agreement, which by the way was actually Minsk agreement. You had like what we call the Normandy format. You had it was dealt by only Europeans. It was French, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. And you see what happens that when you don't have the US meddling, they can find an agreement. This is the thing. You see, every conflict around the world, they can be dealt between themselves. I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia and Iran, they're talking to each other because the US is not meddling. Once you have the US, which is meddling, they're taking one side. And that side actually is feeling stronger. Why would you compromise when you have the US backing you? That is what is happening with Ukraine. Ukraine could be solved by Europeans. This is an internal matter. The same as Asian. In Asian countries, they should actually deal with their own problems. Localization. Africans should deal with their own problems. Why would you meddle? And if you meddle, you have interest. And in the case of Ukraine, create chaos. I mean, for the US, it's fine. You created chaos at the door of Russia. What happened since 2014? 2 million refugees left from Ukraine to Russia. It became a Russian problem. not a US problem. You see how the US is benefiting from that, you know. Do you think for just a second that the US cares about Ukraine? No. Ukraine, it's part of Russian history. You know, if there's one thing, you know, the Russians, they call Ukrainians their brothers, and vice versa, the same. You know, when you have thousands of years of history, I mean, you know, you are brothers, you know, and so that's, I think it's important. And anything, people, they should go back to history. It's really important. I mean, if you have a vision of 5-10 years, you're not being objective. Go back 2,000 years, you know, the links, and look at, you know, this meddling, the foreign meddling, you know, and this is what we're doing. You and I is we're focusing on the meddling, because ultimately those conflicts should be local, you know, and should be dealt by Ukrainians. Ukrainians is an internal issue, and it should be that, you know, and then you can have other countries, you know, that are bordering Ukraine, that can they can be there just to find solution with Ukraine. But it's not the US. I mean, geographically, how far is the US? I mean, it doesn't make it.
I was going to say that. I was going to say, like, they've crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean to inject themselves into the middle of this situation. And the crisis itself is because the United States overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. And this is all but admitted. And you could read articles in the UK Guardian about how they interfered in Ukraine during the so-called Orange or Chestnut Revolution, how they did in Georgia, the Baltics. All of this is admitted. We even last episode of Inflection, there was an NED link where they were bragging about their role in overthrowing the governments in the Baltics and putting in so-called democracies, which is just a way of saying these governments that will work for Western and specifically U.S. interests over the interests of the people actually living in those countries. And so, again, yeah, why is this an issue between the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine when the U.S. isn't even in Europe? And Ukraine is literally on Russia's border, and we're being told that Russia should have no interest or say in anything that goes on its border. And yet the U.S. is, you know, you'll see them crying about China building some port on the west coast of Africa, and how the U.S. is claiming this is somehow in their backyard. It's just completely ridiculous, and it's this. It really is. It's. I know it's overdone, but it's racist imperialism where you just see yourself as above everything else, and even when others do something that is at face value very reasonable, you cannot accept it because you cannot grant them the same sort of privileges you've granted yourself, even in cases that are completely unreasonable, which is pretty much everything the U.S. does geopolitically. I wanted to talk about the Olympics as well. I wanted to get into that because someone in the comment section said how Taiwan has kind of disappeared off the radar because they were going to concentrate on Ukraine, and then when they're done with Ukraine, they're probably going to pivot back to Taiwan. That's not over with. There, you know, the government is still working on behalf of Washington. The U.S. has admitted they've got troops there. This is something that's going to continue and continue and continue. They're trying to move chip production. They've got entire papers talking about if we want to save Taiwan, we have to destroy Taiwan so the Chinese can't get it. I mean, it's just crazy. And if you're in Taiwan, how does that make you feel when you're reading papers that the U.S. has published? Like the U.S. military has published papers about how it's better to just burn Taiwan to the ground than to let mainland China reunite Taiwan. It's everyone recognizes it as a province of China, even the U.S., but they'll rather burn it down than let China like fully reunite. It's very, very twisted. This is about Eileen Gu, and Instagram comments causes fury in China. And if you read this whole article, nowhere does it explain what fury there was. There was no fury. She just said for people to use VPN if they want to see her Instagram pictures, which people in China know how to do, and they do that regularly. And if you're a troublemaker and you're funded by the NED and you're using VPN, maybe you'll go to jail. But everyone else, they're allowed to use VPN. I know many people in China using VPN. So I don't know what they're talking about, but this is what we're bombarded with every single day by the Western media. And this whole story about Eileen Gu, I don't follow sports, but I was following the Olympics this year because of the propaganda campaign being waged against China. And there were people in the West just outright calling Eileen Gu a traitor because she's, I mean, think about it. The anti-Asian hate has been rising steadily in the US. And this is all owed to the Western media telling people that China is this global threat. And you know that the American audience, they're not very sophisticated. And they say, oh, China, I don't, anyone that looks Asian is Chinese. I mean, I'm an American, I'm from America. I remember growing up the absolute ignorance and irrational racism toward Asian people, toward everyone, but also Asian people. Even before there was this big propaganda drive to demonize China. Now it has only gotten so much worse. And when you talk about this, maybe we should, first of all, Angelo, what the propaganda war against China over the Olympics was so broad. I mean, what were some of the things that stood out for you?
Well, there was you see those Winter Olympics in Beijing, they were under bubble. So basically, people competing had to enter this bubble, and you had people working, Chinese people working in that bubble. So if you were a competitor, you couldn't go into the city of Beijing. It was just under bubble, just because they wanted to control COVID. So it's a huge success, Japan, 2 years ago, last year, didn't manage to do that. It was impossible. It's a miracle what they did. So, and from this bubble, you had no exported COVID within the mainland, inside China. So it's a miracle. And you see, the problem is that there's not a single news that is coming from the Olympics that is positive. Even the food, there's probably, 99% of the competitors, they love the food. You have so many great comments. And actually, some of them, they were even banned. I don't know if you followed. There's one guy that actually, he said that is the best food I've ever eaten. And I'm surprised. Everything that is coming out from Western media about the Olympics is negative. But you see, what they're doing to people is that 99% of the news are negative, and people, I don't want to be bad. To be negative about what I call average Joe, but it's people, they get into this reptilian mind that you tell them China bad all the time, and then whenever you have something, it's like the reptilian mind. This very basic, black or white. Oh, China bad. And that's how people, they react now. Everything that is associated to China is bad, because that's how people are. They don't dig. They just absorb. Just eat. Eat whatever the Western media is feeding you. Just don't question. And it's very sad. But that's the reality. You see, they live in a bubble, and can you blame them? If you were to live in the US and you were living in the bubble, that's all you see. It requires curiosity. It requires work just to dig in. How much do we have to work, just to find the truth? It takes work, and most of people, they're in a survival mode. You need to bring food on the table, and this is like a fast-paced society. People take shortcuts. And I think Western mind, Western mind, as opposed to Asian mind, I think you probably experienced this, in Asia, things are more nuanced, it's not black and white. You have the middle way, and once you become more nuanced, then things are much more positive. You see things from a different perspective. It's not black and white, once you start saying, it's enemy or friend, then it becomes dangerous. When you see China, how many enemies China is making around the world? It's not. It's promoting trading. It's promoting infrastructure and so on, and it's dealing with, for example, two enemies, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it's fine. It's mutual interest, and this is the way. It's not about polarizing the world, trying to have only one voice, and this is why we're calling this the multipolar world. Multipolar world is way more positive than bipolar or unipolar. Now we are going towards a world that all the voices are going to be heard. And this is democracy. Imperialism is so anti-democratic. It's so inhumane. Because by definition, you have 4%, the US, 4% of the world population, which is ruling of the rest of the world. And what saddens me is when you have what we call the Stockholm Syndrome. You have people that actually start worshiping their masters. Minorities. When I see Asians worshiping Americans, I'm like, do you understand that? They're not better. They're not better. There's so much that every culture can bring to their own country. Focus on your country, what you can do for your country, and so on. But when you are a minority and you're fighting for the empire, you are the slave of the house. Remember, I mentioned this. The slave of the house, he used to look down at the slave working in the field. He felt it was better. And that's the same when you have minorities that are actually worshiping the empire. You are working for your master. But at the end of the day, you're still a minority. You're still a slave. And
that's actually a perfect segue into what I was also going to bring up. And I try to explain to people, you could be Asian and you could be racist against Asian people, because all you have to do to be a racist is think one group of people is better than the other because of their race. So when you see people like here in Thailand who are involved in the US-backed opposition, they honestly look down on Thai people and just being Thai. And they look up to Westerners. They truly, in their minds, believe that they're superior and that Thailand would be better off being run by the West. This is what they think. It's very bizarre. It's hard to explain. You have to see it to believe it. And this is Andy Borum from Shanghai Daily, and he was reacting to all of this Asian hate, and it's manifesting as violence and even murder in the United States. There are all of these hate crimes where people are being targeted just because they're Asian, because of this toxic climate that the Western media has deliberately created to demonize all Asians. But believe me, it's all about all Asians. China is the main target, but it is all of Asia and all Asians that the Western media wants to paint a target on. And it's manifesting itself in assaults and in murders. And he's reacting to this, and he's talking about these Melissa Chan and I don't know who any of these people are, but you just look at New York Times and Washington Post. That's who they work for. They're Asian Americans, but they work for the New York Times and the Washington Post, these two newspapers that have repeatedly been aiding and accomplices in some of the worst crimes against humanity in the 21st century. They helped lie the public into the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and all of the lies we hear about China. They're there at the forefront pushing these lies. And so, yes, they are definitely responsible. They are Asian Americans who are helping the West paint a target on Asians. So, I mean, it is what it is. And is Andy wrong for pointing that out? Well, people like Will Glasgow from The Australian, who he really is just a racist who looks down on Asian people. He's going to pretend like suddenly he cares about Asian Americans. And, oh, Andy, you're bad for pointing out that these women are directly fueling this anti-Asian hate that's manifesting itself in abuse and in deaths. And I remember I grew up in the U.S. in the 80s and the 90s, the late 90s. And I remember back then when this wasn't a thing. This was like more the U.S. versus Russia, not really China at the time. But I just remember how Americans just in general have this very negative view of Asians. They look down on them. They're racist against them. And I remember in school sometimes, because, you know, we would be taught in school about how racism is bad, and I would hear someone say something horrible about Asian people, and I would tell the teacher, and the teacher would like it was a joke, like, no, we don't, that, no, just if it's about black people. It's wrong no matter who you're doing it to. It's wrong if you do it to black people. It's wrong when you do it to Asian people. But that's my experience growing up. And now that we're in this zero-sum battle with China, where the U.S. sees China surpassing them, this that has always been under the surface, this racism, this hatred, is turning into something so ugly. I really, like, you have to see it to understand how ugly this is. And these women at the New York Times and the Washington Post, Asian American women, Asian American men who are doing it, and just everyone who is involved in this, it really doesn't matter your gender or your race. If you're paying into this, you're helping fuel this, you're guilty. The blood is on your hands. People are being hurt, and people are dying because of this. And it's all leading to a war with China. I mean, we've talked about this, where they've written entire papers about how the end goal here is war. They want to go to war with China. They do not want a non-white nation surpassing Western civilization. They won't have it. They are willing to go to war to stop this. And this is where this is all leading. We've seen this before in history. All of the signs are there. So they're going to fuel apex injustice, and then when you call it out, they're going to say you're a racist, you're a misogynist for pointing out that we're doing these horrible things. It really is. It's absolutely surreal. I get angry. I find it hard to express myself when I'm talking about this. It makes me so angry. Angelo, can you talk about this a little bit?
Well, I have something really important to say, it's especially to Asians and to the global South in general. But to Asians, you know how they divide and controlling, divide and conquer Asia is by actually saying, well, they demonize China. And so you have Koreans, Japanese, Thai people, some of them, they start looking down on China because there's this brainwashing, anti-Chinese brainwashing. And what they don't realize is that this is a fight against, to contain Asia, Eurasia and Asia, and then ultimately the global South. So this is really important not to see that the countries that are targeted are Russia and China. It is not. We need to look at the global context. It's about the containment of the global South. And the global South has been contained forever. Now it's just more subtle. In the old days, they used to have boots on the ground. In India, they would have boots on the grounds, and they would make some deals with some Maharajas. They just divide and conquer. Now it's more subtle. Now it's information space. It's the U.S. spending. We're talking about $500 million per year just only on demonizing China. If you are, it's like racing. If you are racing, you are in a competition. You need to work on yourself, and then you are going to run faster. Why would you actually, try to be unfair to your competitor and demonize your competitor because you don't run as fast as he does? The problem with China is China right now is guilty of its success. China is working on the global trade, by following the rules of global trade. So the global trade, the rules were written by the West, but China is actually doing better, and it's actually it's bringing prosperity to its people. It's actually doing projects that are unbelievable, not for China but for humanity. Belt and Road Initiative is going to change the world, and every single day you see, every month you have new countries joining. You have new countries. The last country was Argentina, they said, we're not going to abide anymore by IMF rules, what we call the Washington Consensus. No, now we are starting to go with China. And every single month, you have new countries joining that. There's a new movement. So what I want to say when it comes to race, people, they need to look at the big picture. It's the containment is not a containment of China. All the economies of the Asian countries are integrated with China. We talk about between 20 to 40, 50% of their trade. Taiwan's trade, 50% is with China. It's going to be a containment of the whole region. And if you contain the whole region, it's the whole global south that is going to suffer. So I look at facts. Facts, it's trade. Trade is money. Money is power. And, even though, for example, India and China, they have problems between themselves, but you know what? The trade is increasing by 30%. Those are facts. And when you look at, you see the issue of Ukraine, it's related to gas. If you look at, take a step back, it's related to gas. Nord Stream 2 is going to be, they are going to have more exchanges of gas between Russia and Europe and Germany. And what the US wants is to divide. They want to decouple Europe with Russia. While Germany and Russia, they want to do trade. And you see, because what happens is that when you start doing lots of trade, you integrate nations, and by definition, you're not going to fight with the country that you are doing 30-40% of your trade with, especially gas. So they say it's a weapon. No, it's not a weapon. It's actually the opposite. Russia and Germany are going to do trade together. Well, because they are integrated, that none is going to be willing to go to war. And this is what China is doing, is winning by doing trade. You exchange and you focus on prosperity. And it's by delivering. You see, the weak point of China is soft power. It's how you market yourself. Soft power is media, is Hollywood. And sadly, the West now is too much brainwashed by that. You brainwashed, China is bad. And China is focusing on delivering. But the problem is that over time, you are going to have people in the US saying, well, there is universal suffrage, the universal healthcare in China. Why in China they have 100,000 kilometers of high-speed railway? When in California, it's been 20 years, they're talking about a small line. Well, you see, The thing is that it's about fact. And China, there's a saying, they say, 事实求是. It's like, look at the truth through facts. And I think the problem is with the West is that, people, they don't look at facts. Not many people, people are just too lazy to go look at facts. And facts are all there. It's all there. 40 years of prosperity. Prosperity, that's what people are looking for. And we say it over and over. Can you eat freedom and democracy? Try to eat it. What average Joe is looking for is having a plate on his table. It's longevity. He wants to live longer, to be there for his children. He wants to bring education to his children. Well, those are the basic human rights, And one of the main differences between West and East, they're looking in terms of society. That's much more powerful. When it's a we, it's not about myself. When in the West, it's individualistic, and it's in favor of a small minority. It's only for the 1%. Remember, when you go to vote, you don't vote for yourself. You are going to vote for a limited choice, and ultimately, it's the 1%. You have two choices. Who controls them is the 1%. And China is changing that. We finally are going to have a democracy, for and by the people, not for the 1%.
And what I think is interesting, you bring up a lot of really good points, and I want to kind of focus in on a couple of them. First of all, it's interesting how the U.S. strategy is very similar between Europe and Russia, and also Southeast Asia and China. And just like you said, Russia doing business with Germany, what better way to ensure peace than have everyone doing business together and everyone losing if a conflict were to break out? But that's not how the U.S. has set up the architecture there. They have set up the architecture to depend on defending against some intangible, omnipresent threat. And this is what NATO exists for, this threat that does not exist. NATO itself is the threat. NATO, in the last 20 years, what have they done? They destroyed Afghanistan. They destroyed Libya. They created this torrent of refugees and migrants flowing into Europe because of their war of aggression against Libya. And now they're doing it again with Ukraine. They are destroying this country. They are creating a crisis right in the middle of Europe. And then they're saying that they are the solution to this, when if you were to just allow Europe and Russia to do business together, there is no threat. It's always funny how the U.S. says we're there to underwrite the security of Europe, and Germany doesn't know what's best for them. Germany is in Europe, and they want to do business with Russia. They do not perceive Russia as a threat. So why is it that the U.S. is the only one that's understands that Russia is a threat, and as if the Germans aren't smart enough to see it for themselves? It's so insulting, and I honestly, I don't know how they continue getting away with it. And they're doing the exact same thing in Southeast Asia, where they've created the Aukus alliance, the UK in Europe, not anywhere near China, and Australia in the Southern Hemisphere, and the US on the other side of the Pacific. They're creating this alliance to confront China, when all of the countries that actually border China are not interested. They're too busy doing business, just like you said, Angela. They're doing business, and everyone is winning doing this business. Now, there was something else you were talking about, the Belt and Road Initiative. And we continuously hear the U.S. talk about they're going to pass this bill, and this bill is going to confront and try to roll back the Belt and Road Initiative. Think about what they're saying. There are countries that are now, for the first time ever in their history, getting modern infrastructure that the West would never allow them to have, or infrastructure that they had, but when they were colonies, and only so the empire could move its troops around to subjugate the people and to move all of the natural resources out of the country. Look at Laos. Now has its first train line. The U.S. was never going to build a train line. And as China was building this train line, they had to demine the terrain of U.S. unexploded ordnance. They had to clean up America's mess to build a train line that the U.S. and now Europe would never have built for Laos or any other country in the region. And when they're saying they're going to stop the Belt and Road Initiative, what they're saying is exactly what you said, Angela. They're going to stop the development, the progress, the rise of the entire developing world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, everywhere. They're going to stop it everywhere. That's what they want. They're a small percentage of the population globally, and in order to control everyone else, they need to make sure there's this disparity economically, in terms of military power, in terms of technology. That's what they're doing, and China's doing the exact opposite. They are empowering these countries, and in the process, they're designing out of their own rise the temptation to abuse their power, because they are building up nations as they work with them. And then it would make it very difficult. If for some reason China decided to be abusive like the US, it'd be very difficult for them to do it, because they're building these countries up. And again, it's in ways the US never has. Now, what was it? It was the European Union introducing this thing called Global Gateway. It's like an even more toothless version of the Build Back Better world. It's just so ridiculous. And it's so funny when you read the articles about this. To illustrate what this idea is, they have to show pictures of China's Belt and Road Initiative, because there is no tangible project that the West has ever built that they could show as an example of what they're talking about going for here. And so it's sad when they say they're going to counter China and the Belt and Road Initiative. They're talking about countering global progress. That's what they're talking about, and maintaining unipolar hegemony over the planet. It's modern day empire, and empire is apex injustice. If you're a person that's against injustice, then you need to be against empire first and foremost, because that is at the very top, is the most abusive form of injustice. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about this. The anti-Asian hate. I mean, this is what the U.S. always does. This is what they did all during the war on terror. They demonized the Muslim world. This is a group of people, over a billion people, and they're acting as if every Muslim is a potential terrorist. And this is what they were saying for like 20 years. And how much damage this has caused, and how many wars they've been able to justify by poisoning people against the entire Muslim world. And now they're doing it again. And again, not just against China. The Western media knows Americans cannot tell the difference between Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Thai. They know that. And so they're they know what they're doing when they're spreading this hate. They know what the consequences are. This isn't the first time this has ever happened. They did this during the war on terror. They're doing it again with this confrontation with China. It is extremely dangerous, and we need to keep speaking out about it. And do not let people like this, toxic individual, Will Glasgow, this racist who's too much of a coward to just come out and say that he's a racist and to pretend that he's going to stand up for minorities when he is helping fuel hatred toward Asia, towards the Chinese and toward all of Asia. Don't let these people make you feel like you did something wrong by standing up against this. They're not allowed to abuse people and fuel hatred every day and then wash their hands of it and say they're above criticism. Don't let them get away with that. That's what we're going to be doing here every week. Angela, I know you feel very passionate about this also. Do you have any, we went over an hour. We didn't really get to questions and answers this time around, maybe next time. Any closing thoughts, Angelo?
No, well, about racism, well, I think it's very hypocritical, people that are fighting racism within their country. I'm talking about BLM and so on. Very often it's posture. To give you an example, they changed the name Indians, they changed it to Native Americans. To black people, they changed it to African American. I mean, those are postures. This is not, you don't fight racism with that. This is just details, it's BS detail. You fight, if you want to be coherent, if you are anti-racist, you fight at the level of anti-imperialist. This is the real racism. And then you fight also in your country. You shouldn't accept that you have a minority being oppressed. Of course. But when you are incoherent, it's like AOC. AOC, she's like always those postures, related to races and so on. But you know what? When you are voting for imperialistic laws to attack other countries, I mean, that is the real racism there. So this is the coherence. I'm not into this movement, anti-racism and so on. I mean, by definition, I think the real fight is anti-imperialism. That is the real fight. If you are anti-racist, so this is what I want to highlight: is you can't not be anti-racist and not be anti-imperialist at the same time.
And I want to give people an example of how you can do both. Martin Luther King Jr., when I was in school, no one ever showed me all of these speeches that he gave, and some of them are absolutely incredible. There's this one. This is my favorite speech by Martin Luther King Jr. It's called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And this is where you have an incredible mind fighting racism at home and apex racism and injustice abroad against U.S. imperialism in Vietnam, and linking it directly to the injustice that everyone was facing there back in the United States. They are directly connected. It is the exact same interests, abusing the people and murdering the people in Vietnam by the millions, who are oppressing you back at home in the United States. You cannot fight one while propping up the other, because then in reality, you're just propping up your oppressor. And so please, I'm going to put the link to this in the video description as well. If you only read one entire Martin Luther King Jr. speech, please read this one, because he covers everything, and you will learn a lot. I know I did when I read this, and for Martin Luther King Jr. Day every year, I like to refresh my memory by going through this speech. It's really great. And they never teach you this in school in the US. Why would they? Why would they teach you this? They want you to think that it's very local and very superficial, black versus white, and they don't want you to understand the very root of injustice and how it preys on everybody, really. So I think that kind of does it for us this week. We're going to try to get back into the swing of things. We're going to try to do this once a week, if possible, and we'll try to get to questions and answers next week. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Angelo, very much. Indispensable. Thank you so much for coming on. Please, if you're watching this after we did it live, please like and share. Check out Angelo's interview with Patrick Lancaster in Eastern Ukraine. It's incredible. Very good job, Angelo. Until next time, bye for now.